Right, hello everyone. Good Lord, okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Jacques Khalip. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English here at Brown. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion with John Dugdale, our featured artist, a discussion that officially inaugurates the Kogut Center's month-long exhibit of 16 of John's photographs downstairs in a show entitled My Friend Is Mine. Before I say a few words about today's event and introduce our speakers, I want to begin with several words of thanks. It certainly goes without saying that we owe a tremendous amount to Michael Steinberg, the director of the Kogut Center, for his early enthusiasm for this project, as well as to Kit Salisbury, Travis Kastner, and Leslie Unak for their organizational brilliance. I mean, virtually everything that you see here today has really been organized by them, and certainly by Kit, so my thanks to them for their help. I also want to recognize the support of the Creative Arts Council and Brown's Humanities Initiative, which gave extremely generous subsidies to our event, as well as the Departments of English and History of Art and Architecture. I also want to thank Ray Clark for his assistance with the photography and with John, so thank you very much, Ray. And as well as my co-participants today, Jonathan Katz, Doug Nickel, and Stuart Burrows, whom I will introduce later on in the program. So the impetus for the exhibit, My Friend Is Mine, and today's discussion itself actually were both born out of friendship, in fact. First having been myself introduced to John's photographs through Rick Rambus, and then being utterly hooked, meeting John in person at his home in New York. Indeed, photography names a kind of structure of friendship for John. Image after image testifies not only to numerous friends who have sat as photographic subjects, but also to transhistorical connections with the photographic world of the 19th century, channeling Julia Margaret Cameron, F. Holland Day, John Herschel, Henry Fox Talbot, amongst others. For John's stunning cyanotypes in particular, an image is not merely the representation of something in the world, but rather it's the received impression of an affect, an emotional dynamic that is given to us to be seen as a measure of our involvement in that very image in the first place. Kaja Silverman, having written on John Dugdale quite recently, has described this kind of image as an analogy. One thing is not merely like another for her, but all of us are interconnected by way of our similarities, giving all persons and things, she writes, equal ontological weight. In John Dugdale's world, the visual image is the principle of such exchanges. The teapot links to the arm, which links to the face, which links to the lace, which links to the hat. If one listens to John, he describes composing these images simply to arrive at something beautiful. But beauty here is less a value than it's the name for the stilled, quiet arrangement of similarities and differences that operate both within and outside of the photographic frame itself. In the description of this show, I've asked, how does photography illuminate friendship? Not only between humans, but between objects and things across temporal divides. What does one see or not see when one looks upon things? What role does photography play in imagining queer love as a historical affect? John Dugdale's brilliant conversation with 19th century photography becomes the place for considering how alternative, non-digital models of image production might turn us to an earlier century's narratives about photographic emergence, not simply as an object from the past, but as the conflagration of the future within the present in the close of prior time. These photographs then are less about the evidence of things materially seen and more about the queer power of things unseen and perceptible in their apparent invisibility. John Dugdale's blindness thus might coincide with a rival form of perception, inner vision or the imperceptibility within seeing itself. His photographs rely on the slow exposure of persons and things to light, and in this way, the deliberate anachronism of the images point to a meshing of places, histories, and identities. My Friend Is Mine thus reflects on the diverse ways in which photography becomes the medium through which the figure of the lover and the friend, the human and the non-human, conjure transhistorical and temporally heterogeneous spaces of possibility and imagination. Now, I can only say so much on his behalf. I would now like to move the microphone over to John to let him begin the conversation today in his own words. Please join me in welcoming John Dugdale to Brown.
there's the mic. You're all so quiet. One of the things I love about speaking to a group of people is I never know what I'm going to say, even in the last moments. And I kept thinking of all the ways I would like to start a brief history of me. Jacques said a lot of the things I'll say in similar words, but guess what? I was born in 1960. My beloved mother, Rose, starting the 3rd grade, was my main supporter as an artist. It was very important for later on. I went to high school where I never took any SATs or any tests of any kind except the aptitude test, which I thought would guide me forward. And it came back that, just as I had suspected, I would be a bricklayer or a gardener. Or maybe there was a restaurateur also. So I thought, well, my fate is sealed. I tried to be a ceramicist. It's terrible. Can't draw a straight line. I have a hard time even writing my own name. And a friend said to me, why don't you take a photo class for credits? It'll just be fun, like in 10th grade or 11th grade. And I found myself in this class. I went to Caldor's, which is a tiny store in Stamford, Connecticut, owned by Carl and Dorothy, and at Caldor's. And I bought some darkroom equipment and a Minolta 35mm camera, and I was assigned a paper. I didn't even realize, I give a presentation in 10th grade. I didn't even understand that photographs were made by different people. I just thought that they appeared in magazines by themselves. So I thumbed through some Life magazines in the basement, and I came across Marlboro Brook White and all her turbines and the Chrysler building, etc. So I put an enormous amount of effort, which I've always done in my life, and it's paid off, and I did sort of a Ross Perot-esque presentation in the class with charts and graphs and a pointer and slides and photographs, and all the jocks and the cheerleaders were snoring and spitting spitballs at each other. But in that moment, with my beloved, wonderfully unusual teacher, who I didn't have a clue, but he wore rainbow suspenders, silver clogs. He had a handlebar mustache with waxed all the time, twinkling blue eyes. He drove a Pacer, this is 1977, with a rainbow decal in the back, and I didn't get it. He said, I'm going to open the dark room up for you, John, because I can see that, you're really going to do something with this. And I went ahead and I won some prizes and ribbons and things, and really, he was the person who, even though I didn't know he was gay or even what gay was exactly, opened up my eyes to being able to dedicate myself to making things. I went to the School of Visual Arts, where I decided I would be the next Alfred Stieglitz. That was my main goal. I had every reason to believe that would happen. I went to school there very significantly, I think, between 1980 and 84, right at the end of the sexual revolution, where going out in the evening, and then afterwards, you and all your friends and pretty much anybody you knew would go to the bathhouse. And with Wild Abandon, we watch each other and we're with each other, watch the sunrise, beautiful men standing on the roof of the building on St. Mark's Place. What we didn't know is about the virus that we're spreading around. And I don't need to say too much about that. We know a lot about that. I contracted that virus, which never gave me a bit of trouble for 10 years. I woke up one morning and had a stroke and knocked off my feet, got myself down the stairs. I only have 20 minutes, remember? So there were some seminal places where I thought I would begin, and one of them that I didn't begin with, I'm going to re-begin again, is really the moment that my life changed again for real. I had been accidentally sucked into a commercial career for a decade. Some friends said, could you do some color pictures? And I said, no, I don't do color work. I was so snobby. I was really intent on being the next major black and white photographer when I was 22. But I did a few pictures. Some art directors saw it, and I was sucked into a commercial career, which came back later in such a beautiful way. I think the reason people love my pictures because you can see them. There's nothing terribly mysterious about them. I know how to light things. I did shoe catalogs for Ralph Lauren and wedding dresses for Bergdorf Goodman, Henry Bendel. I did everything you could possibly imagine. I famously did 20 cover stories for Martha Stewart, who I adored. Don't let anyone tell you anything about her. She's marvelous. And I always felt welcome and deeply respected by her, and I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. And anyway, I went backwards a little bit. I woke up, I had a stroke, I was in the hospital, strapped down, paralyzed, and going blind. My agent called me, and she said, honey, Bergdorf wants you to do a wedding dress picture. What should I tell them? And I said, would you call me back in 60 seconds? And right in that 60 seconds, I realized what happened. And she called back and I said, tell them I'm HIV positive, which people still acted as if it didn't exist, especially in the fashion world. Tell them I'm paralyzed and I'm going blind. And she said, honey, that's what you want me to tell them? I said, yeah, exactly, tell them that. And when I hung up, I knew that my real life had started. And I started this process that leads me right to this podium now. Thank you, Jacques, for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this for a year. And Ray and we just saw a program about synesthesia, another starting point. People ask me all the time, how do you make pictures without your sight? It's very, very easy. The way people see colors and numbers together, they assign certain colors to numbers. From the very moment I was conscious after my stroke, if I heard a piece of music or someone said something, it was before I discovered all the amazing reference libraries on tape from Princeton and the Federal Library for the Blind and Visually Handicapped. I thought I would die if I couldn't read anymore, but to my surprise, I've read more than I did, which is an amazing amount when I was younger and had my normal sight. This is actually my normal sight. I would not change being blind if it was offered to me on a silver platter, because the experience I'm having, it's so mystical, if you allow me to use that word. I read a phrase from Dickinson or Emerson, Whitman, or Thoreau, and in less than a nanosecond, the image appears in my mind. And thank goodness I have a good memory. And I date myself by saying I have an incredibly huge Rolodex in my mind. Right? Does anybody remember Rolodexes? And they come seeing the Venus of Willendorf or the winged Nike Samothrace, you know, or any of the things that I thought it was my duty to see when I was 22, came back nearly instantaneously. I found, standing next to my enormous camera, I turned to a large format camera because I still had some blurry sight in one eye, and in a very blocky, sort of impressionistic way, I could arrange the picture. As the sight subsided, my beloved assistant Dan used my fingers to measure, and people who have asked during interviews, are they really your pictures? And they are my pictures. There's not 1 millimeter of any image that's not deeply considered. And as I stepped away from behind the camera, I stood next to the camera, which I always told people was the size of a Volkswagen, and I play it like a Stradivarius. I can really, really relate to my friends, my family. Recently, I noticed people keep asking me, what is your new body of work? And they talk about the intimacy in my work, even with the still lives. Every single picture has a fairly substantial story behind it. I used to chide myself for not having a diary about this time, but I do. It's just visual, not the written word. And if I had someone who I could sense that they weren't quite understanding what I was asking for in the picture, I would stand beside the camera and I would mimic, while I was talking to them, what I wanted them to do. So the pictures became mirror self-portraits. They're all self-portraits. And I can only do that with the most intimate people. If I met someone that someone wanted me to photograph, I spent some time with them first, not just a cup of tea, but maybe some weeks or longer, a month or two, before I could really see into their soul. I think that's what people respond to. These people were so giving in such an intimate way. They're pictures of my lovers and my dear friends who didn't mind dropping off their clothes and spending the entire day with me, dancers and, oh my goodness, models, and mostly friends. Might be getting near my 20 minutes. And I think, let's see, what I'm really longing for are your questions later, so that I can tell you what you might like to know. There's so much to talk about. I don't really ever know where to start or stop. And Here's the important thing for the end of this and the last beginning for the end. People keep saying to me, what body of work are you working on? What's your new work? What body of work? And I realized that since the 3rd grade, it's all one body of work. The construction paper, the Crayola crayons. I've never felt more satisfied to not think I had to do something, air quote, new or different. Besides exploring a new process, I was recently asked to do a color show, and I kind of shrunk down like a wilted flower, and I thought, I don't want to go backwards to that color work. And I told the gallerist, and he said, let's look at that. He said, there's really not that spirit that there is in the later work. I said, I know, I told you. I've been so sad since I opened up these boxes. I said, why don't you let me do a color show the way I want? And I proposed a gum bichromate show where the color of Easter eggs were only limited by the gum of Arabic and the Winsor Newton color palette, hundreds of colors of ink, a process called anthotype, which are made from mashed flowers, blueberries or various deeply colored berries, and take 2 to 3 weeks to make a very delicate pastel color image. And then the hardest one are anthotypes, and they're made with pure gold, and they're also called chrysalotypes. So that's my idea of the next body of work, which is really the same body of work which I hope I get to do for the next 50 years. That might be my 20 minutes. Thank you.
All right. It's my pleasure to introduce our participants today. All will sort of very briefly sort of discuss John's work today from very particular sort of angles and approaches, and then open up to a more general sort of discussion with John, and also sort of drawing upon you as the audience to sort of participate and ask any sort of questions that you certainly might have. Jonathan Katz is Associate Professor and Director of the Doctoral Program in Visual Culture Studies at SUNY Buffalo. He's also the former Executive Coordinator of the Larry Kramer Initiative for Lesbian Gay Studies at Yale University, the former Chair of the Department of Lesbian Gay Studies at City College of San Francisco, a founder of the Harvey Milk Institute, and the co-founder of Queer Nation San Francisco. Professor Katz was co-curator of the exhibition Hide Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, which famously ignited national controversy over David Wojnarowicz's video Fire in My Belly. As you might remember, that video was quite famously sort of taken out of the exhibit by various kinds of right-wing sort of forces, an action that was completely sort of unknown to and against the wishes, obviously, of Professor Katz. Drawing from this exhibit, Professor Katz is the author of a book entitled Hide Seek, which is an actually extraordinary sort of volume, which I very much do recommend. He also has a forthcoming book called The Homosexualization of American Art, Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and the Collective Closet, which will be published by the University of Chicago Press. Douglas Nickel is the Andrea V. Rosenthal Professor of Modern Art at Brown, where he specializes particularly in the history of photography. Prior to his arrival here, he was director of the Center for Creative Photography and associate professor of art history at the University of Arizona. He's the author of Dreaming in Pictures, the photography of Lewis Carroll and Francis Frith in Egypt and Palestine, a Victorian photographer abroad. He has published numerous articles and catalog essays on all historical and theoretical aspects of 19th and 20th century art and photography. Currently, he's writing a book about Roland Barthes and photography called Camera Lucida Explained. He's also working on a volume about UFO photos from the 1950s and the 60s. Stuart Burrows is Associate Professor of English at Brown, where he teaches 19th and 20th century American literature and culture. He's the author of Familiar Strangeness, American Fiction, and the Language of Photography, as well as several essays on Henry James, some of which form a portion of his work in progress, a study of the third person in 20th century literature. And now, Jonathan, we can sort of start off with you, please.
Thank you, Jacques, and thank you for organizing this and for inviting me. What I thought I'd do is just make some preliminary remarks about John's work while also just cycling through some images so you can have a bit of a visual database to work off of. Titles are there. Foucault once remarked in an interview that homosexuality is necessarily retrospective, inevitably marked by the character of savoring a past encounter, because the next one would always be uncertain. At the most basic level, would there be a next encounter? And if there would be one, would it be safe? And finally, could it finally bring down the weight of law and custom on your head? Retrospective pleasure, in contrast, was untinged by that kind of anxiety. John Dugdale's work is immediately and self-evidently retrospective in character. In subject, costume, titles, and not least techniques, it calls back to the past. But it's not just any past that it calls back to. It's a rather specific one, isn't it? Roughly the early to mid-19th century. This is a propitious moment for the artist, witnessing as it does two fundamental changes for the development of Dugdale's particular retrospective aesthetic. On the one hand, the early to mid-19th century accords with the very moment of photography's birth as a technique, as a medium. And on the other, if Foucault and his followers are to be believed, it was the moment that witnessed the development of the modern homosexual, the homosexual as noun, as a separate being, and not merely as verb, as one who engages in homosexual acts. In what follows, I'm going to very briefly, and I think schematically, try to weave these two historical developments together towards an understanding of John's photography. At the outset, let me note that John is by no means the only queer artist whose work invokes the past or plays with its terms. Indeed, perhaps the central trope of queer art of the 20th and 21st centuries invokes that particular form of retrospective imagining that we familiarly call, almost without thinking about it, camp. The former partnership of the painters McDermott and McGough are a case in point, and I'm showing you one of their works here. Living a 19th century lifestyle, they eschewed modern conveniences like electricity, wore exclusively a costume shop worth of sartorial splendor from that period, complete with top hat and mutton chops, and made work that continuously assayed the history of art and, invoking historical styles, always queered them. Their in memoriam, Andy Warhol, for example, deploys that 19th century genre of the memorial portrait to mourn the then recent passing of the artist. While a subsequent work, Dandismo, uses a broadly Dada pictorial vocabulary to play its pun combining dandyism and Dadaism. But these works, while retrospective in character, have a completely different feeling, don't they, than John Dugdale's. Indeed, I'd hazard that they are in some significant way the very obverse of his work, for they are about the freedom to move freely among different historical periods, updating the past, if you will, by queering it. But they lack a quality so characteristic, even defining, of John's art. That sense of, let's just say it, earnest commitment and romantic attachment that makes Dugdale not the maker of historical pastiches a la McDermott and McGough, but a man out of time, one who seriously wishes, it seems, to return to a very specific mid-19th century past, one that witnessed the very birth of his medium. It's a curious moment to pine for as an openly gay man. In this moment, before the cleavage of gay from straight, there was doubtless more same-sex contact possible, more sexual possibility, a paradoxical, greater erotic freedom, before one was made gay than after. Defining difference and ossifying identity models is certainly one very, very good way to actually delimit the scope and range of your sexual partners. But given the obvious success of gay liberation in nearly every other term, why would anyone queer want to pine for a pre-gay past? Unlike camp, which embraces the very codes it wishes to denaturalize, challenging the hold of the past on the present by showing that the past is malleable and subject to being rewritten, in John's work, there's not even the slightest whiff of resistance to the past that he evokes. But there is here another queer trope, too little characterized, indeed often left to languish unseen, that, like camp, works against history's linearity. This other queer trope, so little noted that I can't even think of it as having a name, also wants to reframe history as dialogic, but it rewrites history neither through irony nor playful recontextualization, a la camp, but through a sober and even solemn sentiment. What this kind of earnest sentimentality offers is a very queer disjunction of living as queer out of the present, of a reclaimed past characterized by the power to write ourselves as we would like to be written, and not merely as the subject written by defining authorities. This nameless trope dreams us back to photography's birth, before photography entered its industrial age with conditions of widespread familiarity, endless reproducibility, and the integration of photography into everyday life. In this earlier moment, photography was truly precious, creating often unique objects which give the photo the look of an innocent pre-industrial age. And in taking the medium back to its pre-industrial conditions of photography's birth, John moreover freezes in the process the fun house, free play of identity that happened once photography had become fully mass cultural. In the old techniques, which were experimental and often one-off, we saw the development of what we call, rather oxymoronically, an original photograph. This original photograph not only looks unique, but in making photography approach the condition of painting in its singular auratic value, in its refusal of mechanical reproducibility, it also freezes the subject, captures him or her in the sense of what that term once meant, not, notably, in the mirror box of endless postmodern performative identities and posings, not in a string of selfies, but as a non-ironic, stable, unabashedly sentimental account of a queer identity that is not freighted with all the apparatus of our postmodern condition. Going back is, for John, the way to go forward. Thank you.
Let's see if I can, oh, here we go. Working? Yes. Good. Well, thank you. One of the most immediately noticeable things about many of John Dugdale's photographic works is their process. The fact that they're printed as cyanotypes and albumin prints or tone gelatin silver prints or photogravures, often made from film negatives produced with an antique large format view camera. Dugdale is hardly the only contemporary photographer to embrace such materials. Beginning in the 1970s, a number of workers began experimenting with what were then called alternative processes. Alternative because they were manifestly not made using the dominant technologies of the day, conventional black and white photo paper or chromogenic color paper. With the new millennium, we were given new dominant technologies, digital cameras and digital prints, but a handful of photographers have persisted in using fussy, complicated, backwards means of making photographs, artists like Sally Mann and Chuck Close. A persistence the critic Lyle Rexer has recently dubbed the antiquarian avant-garde. When used intelligently, antiquarian processes can add an aesthetic dimension that contributes significantly to the work's emotional effect on us. When used less intelligently, we're reminded of those weekend car buffs who labor prodigiously to keep their ancient Model T Fords running and on the road. There are certainly more efficient and reliable ways to get from point A to point B today than in a Model T Ford, and certainly easier ways to make photographs than via antiquarian processes. But for some, just proving that the old apparatus can actually still work is the goal, rather than getting somewhere with it. On cursory inspection, it might seem reasonable to consider Dugdale a part of this avant-garde, but I don't think focusing on process or technique will really get us very far in understanding his project. That project, I believe, as Jonathan does, involves a deeper engagement with the history of images than technical considerations alone will reveal. Dugdale's pictures often self-consciously emulate antecedents in the history of photography and painting, figures and styles from the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I want to show you a few of these prototypes now. But again, I want to stress up front that locating Dugdale's particular sources and figures in the canon of photo history or the history of painting will be just as unhelpful to our understanding as talking about cyanotype printing or Deardorff cameras. Appreciating how these earlier photographs operate on us, on the other hand, can help illuminate how a Dugdale image also works, whether it has a concrete historical precedent or not. This is to say, Dugdale's borrowings from history are not casual, they're strategic, and he certainly has no interest in being seen as working in the manner of Talbot or George Platt Lyons or any other earlier figure. But he is, I think, very interested in how certain of these figures approach their subjects and achieve their results, in the hope that he can achieve analogous results that suit his personal and more modern ends. His process and his historical borrowings are not there in order to display cleverness or mere craftsmanship, but in order to get someplace. Specifically, much of Dugdale's production owes a philosophical debt to pictorialism, the movement that announced in the 1880s that a photograph, despite being the product of a machine, could in fact function as an expressive work of art. Pictorialism held sway until the 1920s, but it originated with an American-born doctor named Peter Henry Emerson, who lived and worked in England in the late 19th century. As a doctor, Emerson was well versed in the latest findings in physiology, so he knew that in Germany, the great naturalist Hermann von Helmholtz had been investigating how exactly our human eyes functioned. Helmholtz convinced Emerson that, as an optical instrument, the eye was a rather imprecise organ, poor at transmitting visual data, but that the human brain was a wonderfully sophisticated organ, which could take this faulty information and, using memory and inference, convert it into the sensation of seamless reality that we take for vision. The eye does not register the visual field before it as a single thing, he noted, but it darts from here to there, focusing selectively anywhere our attention alights. Accordingly, Emerson advocated that photographers not make pictures with deep and continuous focus, but should instead focus on just one element, allowing everything else to lose detail and resolution, as per normal human vision. This is an example of Emerson's work on the right, a plate from his book Marshallese from 1890, next to a Dugdale image of daffodils on the left. Emerson's theory would be nothing more than an overly literal application of science to aesthetics, were it not for one thing. He, like the symbolist painters of his day, realized that dropping out detail and overall resolution from his photographs made them less about the outside world and more like the kinds of images we have in our minds, more like how a memory appears to us, or the irresolution of a dream. The great problem with a sharp, detailed photograph is that it particularizes. It points emphatically to a unique conjunction of subject, time, and place in the real world. In response, pictorialism sought ways to overcome this particularization, because pictorialists wanted the photograph to do what art does, to universalize, to make general statements about reality instead of localized transcriptions of this or that part of it. Emerson's contemporary Julia Margaret Cameron, who made this study here on the right, understood the problem with particularity and developed her own means to soften focus and reduce extraneous detail. Her artistic goals were not scientific, but largely theological. Many of her themes were drawn from Scripture and its representations in the history of Western art, as here on the right, with an Annunciation scene. The angel Gabriel surprises the Virgin Mary in her study and announces she is with child. The lilies beside her are a traditional attribute of Mary and an emblem of innocence, and appear in countless paintings of the Annunciation from the Renaissance on. We see the same biblical moment, the same gesture of startled self-protection in the Dugdale photograph on the left. As a devout Christian, Cameron believed in a Neoplatonic metaphysics. For her, physical objects had reality, but so too did immaterial things like heaven, the Holy Spirit, love, and redemption. The material and the spiritual are not separate realms, but two parts of the same thing. Just as Christ became the physical manifestation of God on earth, so each of us is a corporeal manifestation of divine qualities, our bodies a mortal home for the soul. Cameron's suppression of photographic specificity was thus in the service of a transcendental goal, to help her viewer recognize that the housemaid playing the role of the Virgin here was simultaneously her young flesh and blood housemaid Mary Ryan and an embodiment of the Christian virtue of humility. To realize, in other words, that every girl was in fact blessed amongst women. The real was a vessel for the ideal. The material harbored the spiritual, and the photograph was a way of using the world's concrete substance to point to the dual nature of reality. It does not take any great effort of the imagination to see how someone like Dugdale, who has had greater experience than most of us, deliberating what parts of reality are visible and what parts reside beyond the visible, who has had to confront firsthand the fragility and failures of the body and its relation to the spirit, it's not surprising that he would discover in Julia Margaret Cameron someone who shares an epistemology and who wanted to represent with her camera some higher truths. This, then, is not citation, nor is Cameron merely a historical precedent in her theatricality and stage management of actors and props. On the left is Dugdale's photograph titled, "My Spirit Tries to Leave Me," made not long after his stroke, and on the right a work called Spirit Eye from 1998. In her essay, Illness as Metaphor, Susan Sontag noted how, in the Victorian period, victims of consumption were thought to be closer to God than healthy people. The withering of the body etherealized the sufferer, allowing them to have a transience of the physical and more clearly recognize the spiritual within and around them, such that the delusional rantings of those on their deathbeds were often taken to be visionary glimpses of the afterlife. Photography may seem an improbable medium for taking up considerations like these, rooted in empiricism and the tangible world as it is, but Dugdale demonstrates how photographic allegories about metaphysical questions can do something a painting cannot. His subjects are actual and mythical, words made flesh. In this regard, we might note, too, the example of another pictorialist, the American Fred Highland Day. Day was a publisher and lover of literature, especially the poetry of Keats. His firm, Copeland and Day, was the first in the United States to publish Oscar Wilde and the decadent drawings of Aubrey Beardsley. In the late 1890s, the Boston-based Day vied with New Yorker Alfred Stieglitz for leadership of American pictorialism. His greatest notoriety as a photographer came in 1898 for a series he produced on sacred subjects. Day was a wealthy, eccentric, and not altogether closeted homosexual. In order to accurately present Christ's Passion, he imported wood from the cedars of Lebanon in the Middle East, had a full-size cross assembled from it, and starved himself for a month. Once properly emaciated, he donned a crown of thorns and a loincloth and staged his own crucifixion on a hill outside of Boston, his remote cable release running down the back of the cross to his hand so that he could operate the camera. The self-portrait we see on the right is one of 7 platinum prints that make up a large frame series called The 7 Last Words, evoking Christ's final utterances as reported in the Gospels of Mark, John, and Luke. When exhibited, the works were considered borderline scandalous. Critics contended the sacred subjects were not appropriate for a realist medium like photography. Yet we have to believe, given the uncontroversial acceptance of Cameron and others before her, that it wasn't Day's theme that was problematic so much as the effrontery of a gay man posing as Christ. For his part, Day's self-portrait seemed very much about the concept of physical suffering and the possibility of redemption that can come from it, the burden of having a body and a sexuality, and the transcendence of it. We could go on with this analysis. I'm showing you here a photograph on the right by another notorious American of the 1880s and 90s, a study for The Swimming Hole by the Philadelphia painter Thomas Eakins, beside John Dugdale's self-portrait at Rondout Creek from 1995 on the left. But I don't want to overstay my welcome. Eakins and Dugdale share a certain politics of the body and its display. Eakins was fired from his job as director of the Pennsylvania Academy in 1886 for removing the loincloth of a male model during a life drawing class, a class that included female students. And he was known to answer questions about the proper rendering of anatomy by stripping off his clothes and assuming the pose in question. In painting the result from this photograph, he appeared himself swimming nude right along with his students. As you'll surmise, I don't think Dugdale's politics are anything so narrow as to be about earlier conventions of display or even contemporary gay identity and visibility, complicated as those things are, but about something more ambitious and nuanced. Historical parallels, like Eakins, can sidetrack us as well as inform us. Dugdale's self-portrait here is more about baptism, about the existential condition of isolation and physical sensation, than it is about homosocial desire. The history of art is useful then in providing us a set of thematics, notions that are manifestly important to Dugdale, but we need to treat them as clues or directional signage and not stop looking because we believe earlier pictures have provided an answer to our questions. We're lucky to have John with us here today to weigh in on these very same questions. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks to Jacques for organizing the event, and thanks to John for, I think, what the science is the gift of his images, which is a beautiful phrase. So I'm afraid I have some bad news and some good news. The bad news is I'm not going to be showing any images, but the good news is I'm going to be speaking quite briefly. So there is some compensation there. I haven't really put together a paper, more just a kind of a set of notes about the relationship between literature and photography in the 19th century. If you go to John's website, which is a very beautiful website and incredibly interesting to browse around, what you'll see are images on one side and works of literature on the other, most notably some Whitman's poetry. And John said something very, very interesting, remarkable, really, earlier in his remarks. He said that that his images, or at least some of his images, if I heard him right, that they translate, that they're kind of translations from his reading of passages in Emerson and Thoreau Dickinson, and Whitman, which is a quite remarkable kind of model, I think, for the relationship between literature and photography, or between the arts. In some ways, a much more interesting model than many of the ways critics have tended to talk about the relationship between literature and photography, where typically the way that critics represent that relationship is that photography is a kind of taken as a model, which literature then kind of emulates. And so you'll find that many histories of literature's response to photography in the 19th century associate the camera principally with the realist novel. A form which kind of seemed to, and in fact, many writers did explicitly say that they were consciously imitating the camera's kind of concern for the ordinary and its mimetic attention to detail. And so you don't have to look very far in realist literature to find, explicit expressions of this. William Dean Howells comparing fiction to a Kodak camera. Stephen Crane's work was described as scores of tiny flashlight photographs. But I think that kind of analogy between literature and photography isn't quite what I find, or that's not how I'm thinking about the relationship between literature and photography as I look at John's images. That even that it's something quite different, I think. So what I want to do is just talk briefly about a couple of the 19th century writers that John mentioned, Whitman and Emerson, and to put to talk a little bit about the relationship between literature and photography in the larger context of friendship. Which is the I think very interestingly it's very interesting that Jacques made that the title for the symposium today. Friendship, which is classically about reciprocity, about he was what is the Montaigne phrase? He was because it was he and because it was I, which I think is the title for the symposium is playing off. Am I right, Jacques? That seems to be. But that's, again, not quite the relationship of friendship that I see in these images. So comparisons between American literature and photography actually go back to the mid-19th century, if not before. Harriet Beecher Stowe, for example, declared a desire to daguerreotype Uncle Tom. You find that Poe has a very, very interesting, very brief, but really quite remarkable essay on the daguerreotype, where for him, the astonishing thing is that no matter how closely you look, the detail remains, right? At no point do you find that it gives way, as it were. That's for him. That it's the fact that the daguerreotype is absolutely a kind of perfect reproduction of the visible. The invention of photography in 1839 prompted an extraordinary kind of outpouring of American writing. Periodicals published any number of stories in which photographic portraits become surrogates for their subject, even taking their place in a number of stories. And this idea that the photographic portrait isn't just a kind of copy of its subject, or at least is a kind of copy that threatens to supplant it, is one kind of dominant strain in mid-19th century writing about photography. Which again, I find that analogy between literature and photography that kind of gives way to that seems a much more interesting and complex relation, that idea of the photographic portrait replacing, supplanting the image. And the model for that relationship can be found in Hawthorne's 1851 novel, The House of the Seven Gables, where you have a person in which the subject seems to be produced by his own photographic image. It's a quite remarkable kind of conceit rather than the other way around. A year later, in 1852, Melville, in his novel Pierre, reflected upon this idea and expressed a kind of something close to a kind of a kind of almost hysterical fear about what that might mean. Pierre, it's a strange novel, and often a bad novel, I think, but there it is. Pierre talks about the infinite readiness with which the most faithful portrait of anyone could be taken by the camera. Whereas in former times a faithful portrait was only within the power of the moneyed, today everybody has his portrait published. And in such a world, true distinction lies in not having yours published at all. So for Pierre then, the idea was to escape the camera, that's where distinction lies. But that notion of the camera as kind of flattening, leveling, in a writer like Whitman, produced not a kind of snobbish retreat or fear, but an exaltation. And what drew Whitman to the camera, to photography, was the idea that of a kind of an openness, a generosity, exposing oneself to the world, right? Being receptive, open. The world is kind of making a demand upon you that one could respond with the kind of indiscriminating nature in which the camera responded. Whitman described himself, and I'm not sure if maybe Doug can tell me, but Whitman described himself as the most photographed man of the 19th century, beating out even Lincoln. And he has some very quite funny remarks about the fact that he was photographed so often. I've been photographed, photographed, and photographed until the camera's tired. I meet new Walt Whitmans every day. There are a dozen of me afloat. I don't know which Walt Whitman I am. He didn't just sit repeatedly for his photograph, however. Whitman thought of his work as, in a sense, a product of photography. And in an unsigned review written by Whitman of his own work in the Brooklyn Eagle, he said of Leaves of Grass, "In these leaves, everything is literally photographed. The contents of the book form a daguerreotype of the poet's inner being." And if we think about that again, I don't see that as a kind of analogy exactly, right? The contents of the book form a daguerreotype of the poet's inner being. It seems that John's idea of translating images, something happens within him, inside of him, that when he reads Emerson and Thoreau and Dickinson, that then expresses itself, is made visible in these images. That seems to be very close, in a way, in some ways the reverse, the mirror image, but very close to Whitman's idea of the daguerreotype as a kind of writing, as a daguerreotype of the poet's inner being. I'm going to quote a few lines from one of the poems that you can find on John's website. It's Whitman's poem on miracles. "Why, who makes much of a miracle? As to me, I know of nothing else but miracles." And I apologize. I should have, it's awful to hear this most American of poets in a London accent. I apologize for that. Not miraculous. "Why, who makes much of a miracle? As to me, I know of nothing else but miracles. To me, every hour of the light and dark is a miracle. Every cubic inch of space is a miracle. Every square yard of the surface of the earth is spread with the same. Every foot of the interior swarms with the same. Every spear of grass, the frames, limbs, organs of men and women, and all that concerns them, all these to me are unspeakably perfect miracles." No Englishman could ever say that. But it's a wondrous notion, I think. You find the same idea, amazingly enough, in one of Emerson's journal entries. The idea in the belief in the everydayness of miracles, which I think is it's a conceit you find across that extraordinary generation of writers in the mid-19th century, in mid-19th century America. "Miracles have ceased. Have they indeed? When? They had not ceased this afternoon when I walked into the wood and got into bright, miraculous sunshine." So there you see, this idea, a kind of depiction of the miracle as expressly photographic. And talking to John on the phone last week, we talked about the way that, Emerson's most famous image of the poet as a transparent eyeball is clearly drawn from, his understanding of it. It seems impossible to imagine being said in a pre-photographic era. For Emerson's friend Thoreau, though, miracles were to be found not just in the everydayness of life, although he found them there too, but they were particularly to be found in the act of friendship. Now, Emerson wrote a great essay on friendship, which in thinking about the symposium I read, and he offers a kind of a typically idiosyncratic definition of friendship that for me captures the feel of John's remarkable landscapes. There are more of them available on the website than there are downstairs. But I think it's true of those amazing images of objects, in the exhibition too. It's an as I say, it's an idiosyncratic definition of friendship, but one that I find very kind of compelling thinking about John's images. "Should not the society of my friend be to me poetic, pure, universal, and great as nature itself? Ought I to feel that our tie is profane in comparison with yonder bar of cloud that sleeps on the horizon, or that clump of waving grass that divides the brook? So for Emerson, then, he kind of overturns a whole tradition of thinking about friendship as reciprocity. Although it's intimate, it's also impersonal, in that it brings out the best in us. It brings out or expresses our universal love of virtue and of beauty. Friendship, then, for Emerson, must never be self-interested, must always be a kind of giving of oneself to the other, but of giving oneself to the world, which I think takes us back to that notion of Whitman as endlessly receptive, endlessly open, endlessly generous. So true friendship doesn't require, Emerson is saying, even that it be reciprocated. It doesn't even need a kind of object to exist. This is how Emerson's essay on friendship ends. It has seemed to me lately more possible than I knew to carry a friendship greatly on one side without due correspondence on the other. It never troubles the sun that some of his rays fall wide and vain into ungrateful space, and only a small part on the reflecting planet. So Emerson is saying then you don't even need really to be loved. You don't need a friend, an object, to feel this friendship. That you should think of friendship as like the sun, as is throwing its rays into ungrateful space. It's an extraordinary kind of notion of friendship as a projection outwards. As I say, it overturns the entire tradition of thinking about friendship as reciprocity, which you get from Aristotle through Montaigne on. So it's a model of friendship is thus then, in a sense, a photographic one, in that it expresses a relation to the world that's Whitman-like in its openness, in its generosity, and its indiscrimination, where everything is worth looking at, everything is worth seeing, everything is worth opening oneself up to. And that, I would say, is the world that one finds in John's images. It's a kind of, that's what's, it's their, in a sense, they feel there's a kind of modesty for me in them, a kind of humility, a kind of opening of the viewer to the world, which is, I think, moving, and friendship in its kind of, in a true kind of Emersonian sense. Thanks very much.
What we thought we'd do now is to just have a conversation initially, just for a few minutes, among the panel, perhaps directing questions to John and asking John to respond to various things, and then open it up to a question and answer. And of course, questions directed to John or to the panelists, whatever. But John, I wanted to first give you the opportunity to say if anything was particularly pressing. It must be rather awkward to be sitting here while three of us are talking about your work, and I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you had something to say about it without putting you on the spot.
I didn't know I was doing all that. My eyes filled up a couple of times, and I don't feel like I did any of this on purpose, that it just came from a deep source inside of me that I wanted. There's so many things I want to say. It's a wonderful opportunity to insert a couple of these. When I got home from the hospital, I got upstairs by myself after a year and a half of being paralyzed, and I had to walk again. And I got home, when I was in my studio, and I realized in familiar surroundings I could see everything. I was so excited. I thought I had discovered the mystery of imagery. And I could not go to sleep the first week. I would fall asleep with my feet on the ground, leaning back in the bed. I couldn't even get myself to get in bed because I was so excited about what I saw inside. So it seemed like it came to me on its own from another place after ingesting every word of Dickinson, Emerson, and Whitman over my whole adult life, starting at 22, laying on the floor of my porch in the country and saying to my sister, "You can't believe this. You can't believe it's like another Bible."
And did either of you have anything you wanted to say about it?
So I would like to ask you, John, when did you start reading kind of, the 19th century poets and essay? I mean, what particularly attracted you to that period of writing and that group of writers? I mean, Dickinson, I know, who I didn't talk about, is someone very important to your work too. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you, what brought you to those writers and why they're the ones that most sustain you.
The Whitman started in sort of a carnal way. my dowager aunt, who worked in Mrs. Reppy's bookstore in downtown Stamford, when I told her I found a copy of it, she scowled. And she just passed away. She was about 89. And the more she resisted me reading it, the more I wanted to read it. And I found that my inside, my desires, and my life were written in those words. In no uncertain terms, there's nothing to be ashamed of. At 22, I was so happy to know I could be myself. Dickinson came a little bit later after what I honestly call my near-death experience. I had many days where the doctor said, you know, John, we're going to try to get you through this, but we know about your love of the past, and you're going to have to make believe it's 1790. We just don't know how to help you, because what I had was so unusual. And right when I got home, I got a copy of all 1,776 of Dickinson's poems, and I read every single one nonstop, all in a row, twice. And I thought, oh my God, finally. At 35 or 36, I understand them. It's like she was speaking to me, but I wasn't nearly ready to hear anything in there. And if you look really deeply, she wasn't that reclusive. I was thinking about this today as another way to start the talk. I just titled a picture that I took years ago, "With These I Greet You." She loved her publisher, and I'm sorry, I don't remember his name or where he lived. He was quite a ways away and very reluctant, but she loved him deeply and didn't make any bones about it. And when he finally came to meet her, when she opened the door, she held 2 lilies and said, "With these I greet you." Her formal beauty is something that inspires me deeply. And every word, almost all of my titles are directly from the transcendentalists that I had. In 4 years, I deeply delved into all of their lives. And, you know, it was a little embarrassing, but I kind of feel it's transcendental, and it proves all of the things that they said and wrote, that I can see my photographs to make them. Someone actually came up to me at a show once and said, "Why do you bother making these? You can't even see them." And I said, "You should come and spend a couple of days with me." So I hope that answers the outdoors with the raw and the clear, glistening eyeball on the top of the hill, seeing everything. I feel like the Cheshire Cat, like that eyeball. And, you know, people don't understand, how can you be so excited about being blind? It freed me to hear those words and see them really uninterruptedly. Just the words that created images, every line. So, "With these I greet thee," has been in my mind all winter, waiting for the spring.
Thank you.
So going back to your youthful enthusiasm for Stieglitz, how do you feel about Stieglitz now?
Oh, I love him. And I love his life story, and I love him locked in his potting shed, trying to show that art and photography were the same at the end of his life, doing something called equivalence, where right while the chemistry was freezing, he made sort of beautiful. They were okay, but his point was well taken. He didn't have to have a castrated horse like Spiritual America in the beginning, or the steerage, or anything pictorial. They were just pictures of the clouds floating over Lake George. And so now, in my adult life, compared to my 21, 22-year-old life, which really why I wanted to be in, is I found out that he and Georgia O'Keeffe wore ground-length black German capes and swooped all over Manhattan while the skyscrapers are going up. And I thought, that is what I want to do. I mean, it was that silly. But also, I felt like I discovered only me, the father of photography. And his relational life with Miss O'Keeffe, I imitated in every way. I imitated everything as best as I could, exactly as I could. And whenever I have students, I beg them to please imitate the history of art and the history of photography so that they can move into the future with their own work.
Good. So let's open it up, and if anybody has any questions to direct to anyone on the panel, please do so.
Don't be shy. I wasn't.
Well, perhaps I can begin with a question regarding the differences among the authors that you've been addressing. There seems to me something specifically carnal in Whitman's poetry that is not absent in the other figures, but lesser than the other figures. And I wanted to ask you where you weight the carnal in your work, and whether it was that in Whitman that spoke to you.
You know, there are some things that I've been dying to say to you guys in the openness and honesty that we were talking about. And before any idea of blindness, HIV, or anything, even before the idea of St. Mark's Baths or the wild freedom that was just at the very end when I got to New York and was so celebrated. I read Whitman, like I said, on my hands and knees or laying on my stomach in the sunshine in the hallway in my farmhouse. When I came out of the hospital, so there's a hymn, Carnal. When I came out of hospital, I read Dickinson. It was a spiritual sort of carnal, much the same, but of another world. The bee flying into the buttercup, making love with the stamens of the flowers. It's all there, just in different ways through nature, and very clearly in there if you read closely and you're of that mind. And I wanted to say about sexual appetite in life, it's really easy to say these things out loud to a crowd of people, and I've only realized recently I can say anything because I can't see you. I don't feel shy in the least. One of my beloved models and friends and my lover for 10 years, Daryl, when I was paralyzed in the hospital, I was shocked to realize that I was a total horn dog, and that even paralyzed, I was still interested sexually in him. And I'll forever be in his debt, because he would come in, we called it bivouacking, and he would pull the curtain around. Now, I'm totally paralyzed on the left side. I'm strapped down to the bed. I've got guardrails up on either side so I don't throw myself on the floor while I was having something that were akin to epileptic fits. All very un-AIDS-like conditions, but all of which came to play later in the pictures. Daryl would come, I remember one time, in the snow, in his leather jacket. There were two male nurses, Jim and Mike. One was 6'4", and the other one was tiny, and they watched out for me while I was there. They'd wink, and Daryl would pull the curtain closed, and he'd unzip his pants, and he would lay his penis over the rail, and I would just gaze at his beauty. And I realized that sexuality is your life force. It's not just sex, it's your chi. And I just, ever since then, I've had the perfect answer to give people, and they say, why are there so many full frontal male nudes in your picture? I said, because I love them. They're beautiful. I love well-endowed, muscular, live men. And then to my great surprise, this is just another second, but this is extremely important to me. My book, Lengthening Shadows Before Nightfall, someone called me from England and said, I want to do my thesis project and use your book for part of it. I said, sure, what are you going to do? And he said, I want to go into the non-English speaking, non-exposed to culture people in Africa. And I'll go to various tribes, I'm going to show them a number of different photographers' work. He said, I'll get back in touch with you and I'll let you know what happens. It's okay. I forgot about him. 4 years later, he called me and said, oh, it's me, Andrew. And he said, I want to tell you what happened. And in a nutshell, he said, there were two pictures over and over, the one of your mother and you hugging. And he said, mother, son, good. And then he said, astonishingly to me, he said, the sun god, which is a picture of a Brazilian friend who's, looks like a Greek god, holding some sunflowers over his shoulder in side profile, so there's no possibility to miss any part of his masculinity, which is awesome. His whole body, his whole aura. So they said about that picture, which came out of Chelsea, the West Village, my identity as a gay man, said, oh man, good for a woman. So it left my life, like some of my photographs did, and became more global. It was about fertility. I was never happier in my life. Because even though I am who I am, and my friends are mine, by the way, that phrase came from a George Baum song, who I discovered last summer sitting on the floor cleaning in the farmhouse. He was Bach's teacher, and he just says over and over, my friend is mine. And you know, I was glued. I stopped moving, and I just listened. The announcer said after, that's about God. And I said, no, it's about my friends that I adore that are like God to me. They give me so much energy. I'm letting these trail off a little bit because there are some things I really wanted to say. So here's my moment.
Good. No, it's very interesting. It seems that next time we should inevitably talk about death. So one thing we didn't talk about, is the association between photography and death in the 19th century, particularly marked. But clearly that, so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see your images, as a form of kind of mourning, your relationship to...
You really haven't lived until you know you're going to die. And I had so many days of waiting and then discovering that my energy was not my body. It was so clear to me that I was leaving behind a mechanical structure, that whatever it was that kept me at 98.6 degrees, that's me. It's not my body or whether I went to the gym or anything else about it. And I got out of the hospital, and just one example, I did a picture of myself laying on a fainting couch with stripes and my head leaning back and some lilies on my chest, thinking that I looked pretty foxy, with these lilies. And when I showed it to the John Stevenson Gallery, he said, I couldn't possibly show it. He said, it's way too funereal. And I thought, oh wow, I've been successful, not even meaning to be, but the idea of mortality became so deliciously acceptable to me because I saw how peaceful it could be after my initial struggle. I was like in a straitjacket until I realized, you know what, there's really nothing I can do about this, which is the same for everybody. You can't really do anything about what happens at all at the end of your life. It's going to happen to everyone. And I feel so great. I got to have a stroke. I got to be paralyzed. I got to go blind. I had cancer. I had split on my jaws. I was very, very sick. I tried on everything at the age of 33, 34. Now I don't have to do it when I'm older. So I feel like I can live to be 100 and have experienced those things already, have no fear of them, so I won't attract them to me again. So just in being myself, recently I've felt more like a teacher just by living my life the way that I do, and the pictures are incidental. They ooze out of me from nowhere in great big batches. I don't take a picture every day. I might spend weeks looking for just a certain piece of silver or china, which are also imbued with lots and lots of chi and mortality. They were handled by other people from different times, and I feel so honored to surround myself with the past as a way, like you said, to move into the future.
Sure.
John, this is a question for you, which I know you've fielded millions of times, but I think it's sort of really sort of important to talk about. And also, I think in part, Jonathan, if you could sort of also sort of address it a little bit. Can you talk about what you're most sort of famous for are your cyanotypes? So what was it that sort of drew you to the cyanotype? Let me put it this way, there's a huge distance from Fox Talbot and Atkins to the blue of Derek Jarman. Certainly all sort of like names that are there sort of freighted in your work. Was it about the production of those kinds of images, the color, and what are your own sort of links to it in terms of a kind of your own sort of feelings about how it's sort of linked to, let's say, the blueness of a kind of sexuality, a kind of gay sexuality there that's sort of thematically repeated beyond your own sort of work?
Do you want to answer that? I've been hogging up the floor.
Well,
and then I'll...
yeah, I mean, I certainly want to just perhaps note the degree to which blueness, as you suggest, has a long queer history from Blue Boy onward, and of course blue movies and all of this. But it also, of course, touches not only on the question of sexuality, but the material process of making these images is fraught with danger, is it not? Well,
not this one. Many of them are, but that's one of the reasons I chose this one right out of the hospital. It's so simple. It's a simple process that's very non-toxic. It actually develops in water.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
right.
some of the other ones, some of them are something I would either stay away from the darkroom or have it done off-site because they were so toxic.
Yeah.
But I embraced the cyanotype first because it was simple.
But to sort of elaborate on Jacques' question, to what extent is your post-hospital investment in an entirely new kind of, well, not only coloration, but as it were, a new filter or frame on your imagery, a product of your experiences?
As so often, it's the viewers that tell me what I'm doing. I made those cyanotypes. I meant them just to be for my family and friends. I was only 6 weeks out of the hospital. I called the Wessel O'Connor Gallery and I said, I want to have a show. I was being so audacious. I was still in my pajamas, learning and using the cracks in the floor of my studio to walk from one side to the other and then raising up the canes like grandpa, like, oh my God, I made it across the studio. And I called them. They didn't even know. I kept it secret from them. I'd had a show with them in 1990. And they said, well, we'll let you know. And I said, okay, well, that's great. I planted that seed. And they called back in 5 minutes and said, can you make that show in 6 weeks? I hung the phone up in shock. And I said, in 6 weeks? Thank goodness they said that. So I looked around and I thought, okay, everybody does a cyanotype in high school or in college. They have sun prints. Everybody's made one. Kids make them. Everybody makes them. But what I didn't know that I was starting was my enormous body of self-portraits. And that's my biographical boxes and boxes of photographs. The part about the blue, I don't think it's gay or straight or male or female. It's everything combined. The sky is blue is one thing, but the really important moment is at the first opening, which, by the way, I didn't think anybody was going to come to that. And I thought my family would come and some of my friends. So I thought I've got to drag the whole hospital to the gallery so I can show people what I went through. And I thought, oh, I'm going to put a Civil War tent and show Whitman bringing oranges and kissing those beautiful men who maybe were about to die. Well, he was redressing the wounds, the wound dresser. I said, I need to show them how I feel like Whitman a little bit. And I thought, well, I better get rid of the tent. That's too much. They'll kill me. And I went on. And what it ended up, essentially, and this eventually gets back to the blue thing, Jacques. I had white frames with white liners. They allowed me to paint the floor brilliant white. I painted the ceiling white, the walls. Everything was white. And I had some beautiful mercury glass shades. And I hung up 25 of them. And the elevator opened into this room. It opened directly into the small gallery room. And I heard later from people it was like walking into a blue blizzard. So this is important for me to get out of my system. Before the show opened, or like I said today to Jacques, I always feel like no one's going to come to these events. I'm always so surprised when such lovely people show up. So I thought I have to thank the universe for these pictures being on the wall. And I laid down on the floor like Michelangelo's Golden Rule. No one was in the gallery. The folks who ran it were way in the back in their loft in Tribeca. And I just laid there, and I absorbed the uncanny thing that just happened. I stood up and I thought, well, okay, I'm ready. And a few minutes later, there were 400 people in this tiny room. I was swirling around. Everyone felt the need to touch me to make sure that they knew that they checked themselves out of the hospital to come to support me. I think if I had thrown up on a piece of paper, they would have come and supported me just because it was so audacious to be newly blind. And also, not just my friends in my community, Martha Stewart, Maurice Sendak, many notable people who are also my friends. One woman, and this is the whole point of this shock, came up to me and said, you know, the color blue, in the highest state of meditation in the world of Buddhism, you see a blue pearl in your forehead. And it just so happens that my optic nerve is still working, and I'm not blind in darkness, I'm blind in bright flashing color. And there's a lavender, orange, and blue circle dead in the center. When I close my eyes, I see it. When I open my eyes, I see it, even out of my blind eye. And she said that, and I thought, oh, fantastic. I didn't even know that. And whenever I had a show after that, if I thought, well, too bad I had to make them blue. You know, it was easy, and I made something harder, like albumin. It was inevitable that someone would say, aren't you going to make any more blue pictures? So I thought, I don't have to keep changing. People seem to be moved by this color in a deep, beautiful, mystical way. Some melancholic quietness comes from that color that seems to be universal to people.
Yes.
Long answer, sorry.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. John, and also to the panelists, I'm really curious about the relationship between the mystical and retrospective. John, you referenced the mystical in your earlier remarks about how visualizations come to you as though you were a mystic. And I was really intrigued by that notion to the extent that mystical time seems to disrupt straight linear time and the kinds of implications that might have around invocations of friendship and sexuality. And I was wondering, for you,
this interplay or interchange of temporality between the mystical and the retrospective that was so nicely staged by Jonathan around the kinds of methods employed by, say, camp aesthetic that seems to be in contradistinction to what you do, at least as read by Jonathan, in the ways that there is a kind of unvarnished whole or sentimental longing for the past in your works. But the question of a mystical kind of composition seems to reconfigure some of that. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, and if you compose that imagistically or textually, and how do you think about this this issue?
If everyone in the room would close their eyes for one moment and think of their mother's face, see how clearly you can see her? I have that all the time, and I was always embarrassed for the longest time to use the word mystic. And during Lent, a few years ago, my beloved friend and spiritual guide at St. Luke's, my Episcopalian parish for 30 years, said, "Why don't you give a Lenten meditation?" I said, "I don't know how to do that." He said, "Just show you pictures and talk about them." And I did, and afterwards we went home to have a drink and celebrate. It was a very lovely event. And he said, his partner, or his husband, is also a priest, both young men, they said, "We think you're a mystic." And I was embarrassed. And I turned my back, and I got a little red, and I said, "Don't be silly." And he said, "The mark of a true mystic is that they deny it." And I thought, well, alone at that night, and I thought, I don't want to say that too much because it seems a little corny, but I kind of have to say it because I don't really know where the composition comes from. You know, I can feel a tree when I'm walking towards it. I can feel someone's posture to the minutest degree. I can just shift their finger or shift my body so that they will. I feel like the energy that they're meaning is something that we all can recognize really easily, but we don't have to because we're encumbered by our eyesight. You know, so I feel as free as a bird that way. And if that's being a mystic, I don't think it's just singular to me. I think everyone in the room, like you just saw your mother, where did that come from? Where even Da Vinci, Ray and I just watched a beautiful documentary. We spent the entire winter trying to watch every documentary on Netflix. Now, I don't even see them, but just hearing the description of his writing, he understood how the eye worked mechanically, and he delved into cadaverous brains looking for where the images went. And he perfectly called it the visual cortex. He called first the seat of the soul. And I feel like that's where I am happily sitting. And we have that. Everybody has that. Your imagination, your dreams, you know, you are a mystic. You just waking up every day and taking a breath is mystical. After being so comfortable and nearly losing that, there's nothing. I get aggravated. I throw my cane across the room. Sometimes I throw my coffee on the floor. I just get aggravated as a blind guy sometimes, don't get me wrong. I fall downstairs, I fractured my nose, I walk into lampposts and stuff. But all of it pales with the sort of secret that I feel that I have, that I like so much to share through my photographs. Does that answer some of your question? Excellent. Is there a photograph that, oh, sorry. I'm afraid I don't know where you are. You'll hear it in one ear, so I'm looking all over.
On this side.
Good, wherever you are.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about this next project. You kind of tantalizingly offered a suggestion of moving towards gold, kind of a shift and return to our earlier conversation about color. And this quote from Dickinson that you were alluding to, that's been waiting for you to come back to in the spring. And with that, I'd also be curious to hear a little bit more about the use of Catholic imagery, Christian imagery that you've been referencing as well, and how that kind of relates to the transcendental mystics that inspire you, whose writings inspire you.
You know how you always say, "Oh no, I'm so sorry I had to do that." I made all those Martha Stewart and New York Times food pages and cookbooks and shoe pictures a little bit. I used to go outside the studio in Soho, which is on the ground floor that I rented. I put one leg up, and I'd lean against the building. I look up at the sky and say, "Oh my God, what are you doing? You're supposed to be the next Alfred Stieglitz." Well, when they're paying you $30,000 a week at 24 to do an entire week of getting the shine just right on a shoe, how are you going to turn it down? I don't even know what I did with all that money over those years. I didn't even buy my house with that. I bought it with tips. So just put that aside for a second. And then you go forward. I've thought of this while you were asking the question, so I'm going to say it, although I'm not referring directly to what you said. Later on, the imagery that came to me was already thought out through those commercial pictures, in that they were lit beautifully so that it wouldn't be the image bonking you in the head. It would be the contents, just like something you were supposed to sell. That experience came back to give me beautiful, readable imagery. I thought, if my dad can't understand it, I don't really want to take it. And usually what he does is he stands in front of the new pictures of my sister at openings and hopes someone will buy them, or at least he can block them with his body. And the color, I was wonderfully challenged recently by my gallerist, and the whole gallery, oh, we saw one of your pictures of the sheep from the New York Times in color. Your color work is fantastic. And I was like, oh, okay. And they came up to see the work, and poor Ray, I drove him crazy on the computer day and night. I walk in, wake him up out in your sleep and say, what's anthrotype? How do you make the, we're looking at every one of the manuals to find out where could I go with color that was true to my nature and my love of the past to represent myself now. And we found beautiful things. Some I knew about already, the incredible process where you brush on gum bichromate onto a piece of paper. Then you do various things, and then you brush it. You can use a brush. It's kind of like batik. You can add colors. I'm not interested in that at all because I won't be able to brush it the way I would if I could see. There'll just be single coat gum prints, 16 by 20, of various things. It's Lent and Easter. And the thing that I love the most about Easter baskets are the green cellophane that my mother used to fill those baskets up with. But more importantly, the pastel colors of the eggs, which are a sign of rebirth in life for everybody, not just Catholics or Muslims or Buddhists or anyone. And I actually researched the history of the bunny rabbit for Easter and the egg, and it was meant to represent rebirth and spring. So when I said that I was coming back into that and the work was going to match, what sounds more delicious than pastel green and light orange? Well, I'm going to go out and buy one of the boxes. Remember PAS coloring, PAS? That you got the little wire and you got the vinegar and your mother boiled the eggs, and it'll smell like vinegar, smelled like Easter to me. Because so we're on Quiet Saturday after Good Friday, we're going to dye a whole bunch of Easter eggs. We're going to dip paper in the various dyes, because when you're bored at the end, when you're a kid, you start mixing together, and you get these other colors that are really beautiful, and I'll send them to the gum bichromate master that I know in Pittsburgh named Stan Klimick. And the gold prints and the flower pictures we're going to make ourselves, because I can't wait to mash up things in a mortar and pestle. So I'm silly in my answers sometimes, but I'm really deadly serious. If I can bring the outside and color into my life in a way that I feel is transcendent and beautiful and sticks with my deep aversion to computerized printing, I love it. It's beautiful. There's not a better way to make a color print, but there's not the hand of God in there. There's not the artisanal part. And I tell you, they're beautiful, and I tried to wrap my mind around them for these Easter renewal pictures, and the gold, and the lavender, and the cranberry, and the blueberries, but I couldn't. So I found the other processes. And it's the same thing I said before. I hope that sort of answers your question.
It reminds me of an interesting anecdote. I don't know if you've heard this before, but one of the original inventors of photography, Hippolyte Bayard, was once asked how he came up with the idea for his invention. And he mentioned the story about his father, who had orchards and was very proud of these peaches that he grew. He would grow enormous peaches and bring them to the county fair and win prizes every year. So his display, the father's display of peaches, featured a pile of these specimens and one on top that was monogrammed. What he would do is he would cut out a paper stencil with a letter B on it and attach it to one of the peaches when it was still white, hadn't ripened yet. And then when it was time to take them to the fair, he took the stencil off, and there underneath would be the unripened part of the peach. The rest of it would turn orange and but there would be a white bee on it. And that reminded him, Bayard, that of this photosensitive material in plant life. Photosynthesis is essentially a process analogous to the way photographs are made. But it points more significantly to how, in the Romantic period, before photography became understood as a technology or was industrialized, it was seen much more as a natural process. It was seen more like harnessing the power of nature, which for Emerson, the transcendentalist, meant harnessing what God has given us, making a power in nature work for you in various ways. So that idea of the sunlight radiating out into space, but then becomes useful when it lands on a certain thing, it's sort of apropos of where photography was originally thought to have come from in the 1830s and 40s. You'll have to try that, light-sensitive eggs and peaches and things like that.
Can't wait. I knew I wanted to be a farmer photographer when I could see fine. I went to the Waking Dream at the Met, which changed my life, that show. And there was a great big case with a big book wide open, each side this thick, rustic paper, and 4 pictures on each page. And each picture was a picture of a pickle, a raw pickle from a garden. And this farmer was doing his genetic experiments, getting the best possible pickle he could get. And he put a little NO1, and he numbered them. I thought, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I'm going to go up to the farm. I'm going to be a farmer photographer. And I went up and I made the whole show. And I showed it, and my goddess of photography, Judy Siegel, who taught alternative processes before anybody ever said it 35 years ago, very, very outspoken and has no problem expressing herself. And she came to the show and she stood in the middle of the room and said, wow. She said, you tried to be a 19th century photographer, but you're a child of the 20th century. She said, there's no way, you can be that person. I was a little disappointed, that I couldn't be Mr. Nature. I was like up on the roof of my house with my print rack and everything. And I still make prints that way, but I'm very happy to be part of my generation mixed with that time, with that natural, beautiful, that thing about sunshine, lighting. You don't have to know someone to love them, or you can love them without them loving you back and still be just as fulfilled. That really struck a note with me. Appreciate that, so beautiful. I think you said that. Everybody's voices are melded together.
There's one other question.
Maybe you just answered this, actually. So 2 themes strike me in the conversation. One is I feel like I've been in the 19th century for the last hour and a half in a very wonderful way. And the other is the attention to editing things out, sight, color, the computer. And I just wonder if you could reflect, or maybe not Mr. Dugdale, but the others who know more in their interpretive mode of looking at his pictures, what is edited out by removing the 20th century? And that's something that you just spoke to, Mr. Dugdale, just now for yourself, what was there and what was missing. But as I think of my own interest in editing and my own interest in the history of art, it's hard for me to imagine how I would get into the space we've just been in, where the 20th century was edited out. And maybe you could speak a little bit to what that's about and what that means and what's missing.
Part of it came genetically, because when I was a child, I was disappointed that we had electric lights, and I wanted to live by candlelight, but I didn't think anybody did that anymore. And when I began that unwanted commercial career, it was a pretty nice way to start. My friends from brilliant, most popular florist in Manhattan said, we're going to give you the van and drive up to the house, and we're going to just try to take some pictures, some color pictures. And they filled the van with flowers. And I thought, wow, these people are letting me, they don't even know me, they're letting me borrow their van in the snow. So I got in the car, and it was like the Garden of Eden. And contained in wooden steps in the van, full of flowers I'd never even heard of before, like ranuncula. Who knew what that was? I had a crash course. Drove up to their house, slower and slower down winding roads in the Catskills, harder and harder snow, and I thought, oh no, I'm late for my first job. And I pulled up to the house eventually, and I looked up. It was a squat stone Dutch house with curling smoke coming out of the fireplace, and I started my apology. There were candles lit on the posts of the fence in the snow, and I looked around and I was like, oh my God, I still was only worried that I was late. And I opened the door, and there was my gay aesthetic awakening. And there were candles everywhere. There were no lights on. The fireplace was roaring with Stu in the fireplace. I was apologizing. He said, "Don't be silly, you're not late." Their gay Cocker Spaniels were laying down on their L bean, plaid, just the right plaid pillows, and the furniture was the perfect time for that kitchen. He said, "Sit down and have a glass of wine." And in that time, I felt like I stepped through and I thought, oh my God, people actually live like this. It was such a revelation to me. The part that's cellular, that started when I was little, when I got to my house, because when the book was over, I thought, I can't go back to noisy Manhattan. I don't want to be a house guest on the weekends. I want my own house. So I went to this beautiful spot. I found the farmhouse surrounded by cornfields that was unexpected. And the first thing I started to do, with the excuse that the electricity was old and dangerous, I thought I better take out that line. And I thought, well, if that one was bad, I better take out that line. And then I sneaked out every bit of electricity from the house, took down the fuse box, and disconnected the house from the phone pole. And lived like that for 10 years. David and Peter are brilliant artists. I love them. And in their serious camp stuff, like, I don't find a bone in my body that feels campy. I did that. In all seriousness, I felt like I had a nervous breakdown if I lived in the house with electricity. I wanted to experience quiet from the time that the house was built. I took a picture from the roof and I thought, oh, it would be so marvelous if those telephone wires weren't ruining the view that hadn't changed since 1850. And when I got the picture back, here's a way of editing through the words. And I called it a cornfield with telegraph line. And no one noticed that it was a phone line. So I would like to get a truck and plow up my road so that I could see what it sounds like when horses go by in a cart. When the house was written about by the New York Times, it was kind of silly because everything that was in the house was purchased at the local flea market in High Falls. My rule was I can't spend more than $10 or I'm going to lose the house because I was getting used to the mortgage. And I furnished the whole house with found objects, some incomplete, but they seemed whole to me. And when the woman came to spend the day at the house, she was going to write the article. Again, somewhere this is about editing your life in the way that you live. You don't want to just edit your art. You want to edit your life to whatever you think it should be. There's no way to hold reason. There's no reason to not. And some people came and they were grinding up the trees. The electric people were cutting down the beautiful sycamores. They were trimming them like they do every year. I said, "Would you excuse me?" And I ran down the driveway. And I said, "Could I have those wood chips to put in my berm?" And they're like, "Oh, fine, we'd like to dump them here." And I went back, and the woman was just sitting quietly by the fireplace, and she said, "This is the quietest space I've ever been in." I said, "That's because you don't even hear the hum of a refrigerator. I bought ice, I used snow, etc." So, like, in just talking to myself, I didn't really edit my work. I edited my life. And I still feel like that person, although my family said, if you're going to go back to that house, blind and, whatever else, we insist that you get electricity. So, all right. So I got some modern Romex cables, and I hid them in the walls. I got nice sockets with tiny carbon filament light bulbs that only were like 10 watts each, and I put them all over the house like fireflies. And I could still see through the bottom of my eye a bit, so I used them like markers. So even in having to change from my initial editing of my life and the way I wanted my work to be, there's always a way to reinterpret it continually. And those light bulbs have become a trademark that I usually install larger shows lit with those bulbs. How's that?
That's great.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you all for coming.